Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to discuss Kant on what's right. More specifically, for this week we looked at the first part of the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Now that title is a mouthful, but really Kant is interested whenever we make statements like helping others is morally right, or killing other people, murdering them, is morally prohibited. Kant wants to give a theory about morality, which amounts to a theory about the nature of right and wrong. What makes certain actions right and what makes certain actions wrong. A common view is that morality is based entirely on subjective self-interest. In this view, we all define morality for ourselves, and that morality is something like a subjective set of prescriptions for going about and living your life. But Kant disagrees with this view. Kant wants to develop an objective theory of morality. In other words, a theory of morality according to which we can say that certain kinds of actions are absolutely, unconditionally, morally wrong. So let's get into the basics of his theory. Kant starts out the work by pointing out that there are many things that we call good. Right? So happiness, for example, we tend to think that a happier life is better than an unhappy one. Virtue, these are certain characteristics or certain excellences of your character. For example, being courageous or being generous or being honest, right? We tend to think of these as a kind of good. And then there are other worldly things like talent, luck, success, money, and the like. We all, generally speaking, take it that a life that has these features is indeed a better life than one without them, right? However, importantly, Kant is going to point out this about each of these good-making features, which is that they're only conditionally good. So, for example, I think that it's very plausible to say that happiness is a good for everyone. Everyone wants to be happy. Everyone would rather be happy than not. However, Kant brings up the case, well, what about when people are happy because of immoral actions that they've taken, right? What if someone is happy because they were able to get away with great acts of evil, for example, right? In this case, we would look upon that happiness as morally reprehensible. We would wish that it didn't exist in the world, right? For someone like Hitler, right, someone who is absolutely unconditionally morally evil, we don't want them to be happiness. We don't view happiness for them as an overall moral good, right? So what we should conclude from that is that happiness is generally good, but it's not absolutely good. So morality being about what is absolutely right or wrong is not, chiefly speaking, about happiness. We can go through all of the other goods and we'll see similar cases. Is it good in general for human beings to be charismatic? Yes. Was it good that Hitler, for example, was charismatic? No. Similarly, in the case of talent, luck, and success. These are goods in life, but as I said, they are conditionally good. So what's the one thing, Kant asks, that is unconditionally good? And he thinks that we all already know the answer, which is a good will or a good intention. In other words, the desire to act according to morality, right? It's specifically when someone intends to be good, right? Sets their character upon being good, that only this can be the unconditional good, right? This is good in every circumstance. Even very evil people, whenever they intend to be good, that is better than if they had not, right? And so Kant is going to present a view of morality that's a form of deontology, and indeed the most famous form of deontology, which is a moral theory that focuses on intentions and reasons for your actions rather than the consequences. So for Kant, an action can produce good consequences, but be performed for an evil motive, and in that case the action is evil. Similarly, an action can do a great amount of harm to a number of people inadvertently and come from a good motive, and Kant thinks that we ought to assess their actions to be good in this case. So what morality is all about for Kant, what he observes as the consequence of this insight, is that the goodwill, right, an assessment of the motivations underlying rational behavior, is the supreme principle of morality and the source of morality's authority. One way that Kant puts this point that I think really drives home what he's saying is that morality is not about how to be happy, but how to be worthy of happiness, right? The moral conditions under which we can rightfully wish for this person to be happy. So since Kant gives this kind of account, he actually has to give a sort of dual character account of moral action. In other words, moral action, all instances of moral action, consists of two independent components. There's what Kant calls conformity with duty and acting from duty. Here's what this means. Conformity with duty just means that you are following the laws of morality. So morality says, for example, not to steal, not to murder, and so on, right? And following these moral rules is sort of like the bare minimum of morality. We can enforce especially severe cases of immorality with police action. So, for example, if you steal or rob from your neighbor, for example, then that's such an egregious violation of duty that we take it that you should be punished for that. Hence the existence of the police and political authority on Kant's account, right? So there are rules of morality that become codified into law that are the basic benchmarks for participating in society, right? Like not being violent and so on. But then Kant thinks that genuinely moral action has another requirement in addition to being conforming with duty. You have to act from duty, which means, in other words, you have to be motivated to take the moral action because of morality, right? So in other words, if you just accidentally conform with duty, that for Kant, strictly speaking, that does not constitute a moral action. To illustrate this point, Kant uses the example of a shrewd shopkeeper, right? So in this case, a shopkeeper is running a shop, and a young child, say a young boy, whatever, comes to a store and tries to buy something, and the young child is going to overpay significantly, right? Well, it might be the case that the shrewd shopkeeper would not rip off the kid, right? In other words, the shopkeeper would make sure that the young child pays the appropriate amount for whatever it is that they purchase, right? Rather than ripping them off because they don't know better, right? So if the shopkeeper, fails to rip off the child, then the shopkeeper conforms with duty. But now we have to investigate the motives of the shopkeeper. And the shrewd shopkeeper might be, for example, failing to rip off the kid only because he knows, for example, that the parents will be mad. He'll get a bad Yelp review and be on the outs with his community and so on, right? So in this case, even if the shopkeeper does the right thing, they're not doing that action because it's right. They're doing that action because it produces the best consequences, and it's just an accident that their action was moral. And so we not only need to act morally, but we need to make morality our motive whenever we act morally. And that's the criteria that the shrewd shopkeeper fails. Hence, Kant would dub his actions immoral still. So morality is very, very demanding. It's demanding not only on our action, but also on our intention or the motivation behind our action. Because we can't, know the inside of other people's heads, right? We can't know the motivations of their actions. We can't enforce this part of morality. But luckily, we do have institutions that attempt to provide spiritual guidance on this behalf, and that's how Kant thinks about religion, is that churches and so on are supposed to, in a way, encourage you towards morality and ensure that your morality is the motive behind your action. Okay, so now we've said some general features about morality, but we still haven't said what constitutes a good will, right? What kind of rules do you need to follow in order to qualify as a good will? And Kant is going to talk about this a lot over the next week or so, but his first stab at it is this so-called formula of universal law. Here Kant says, quote, "I ought never to act except such a way that I could at the same time will that my maxim should become a universal law of nature." In other words, what Kant is saying here is basically a version of the golden rule, right? Treat others how you would like to be treated. Kant's version of this is to say that you should imagine that the principle or motivation for your behavior is the principle or motivation shared by everyone. And would you want to live in such a world, right? So, for example, would you want to live in a world where everyone steals from each other whenever it's convenient, and so on, right? And Kant thinks we should just know that such a world is worse than one where we don't steal from one another all the time and respect each other's property. In other words, whenever I take a reason for an action to be motivating for myself, I must intrinsically think that that reason could be motivating to other people as well. My way of summarizing this is to say that a reason for me is a reason for thee. In other words, anything that I accept as a legitimate motivation or reason for my action, I must also take it that others can think about this issue this way too. Importantly, Kant's not saying that this is actually going to happen, and he's also not saying, that everyone has to be the same. So, for example, when I choose to be a loving daughter, am I saying, for example, that everyone in the world should be a daughter, right? But we're not looking at my actions, we're looking at the maxim or the principle that underlies my action, right? So what is the principle or motivation behind my relationship with my mother? Well, it must be something like this. It must be that I think that people, generally speaking, should be good to those who are good to them, right? My mother has been really loving, warm, amazing person in my life, right? And so the general principle is that I should reciprocate this behavior. I'm not saying that everyone out there needs to love my mom in particular, but I'm saying that everyone should be motivated by the same kinds of general rational attitudes about the relationship between right and wrong that I am. In our next video, we're going to discuss more substantively what Kant thinks that this formula of universal law says about how we should treat other people, which Kant says that we should treat other people with respect and, above all, respect their human dignity. Now, do you agree with Kant, the general, overall view of Kant's moral theory, that we should examine the reasons for actions and the intentions that people bring to their activities? Or do you think instead that a moral theory ought to assess, for example, the consequences of people's behavior? As always, I'm so interested to hear what you think, and I will see you in the next video.